You can see, and this is one of the more important things. You see this right here? You see this right here? This is Caitlin's agent. This is Caitlin Clark's agent.
Welcome back to the Clark Update, WNBA fans, because a major situation is developing around Caitlin Clark, Stephanie White, and the New York Liberty. With reports and online speculation about a possible move involving Clark sending fans into a frenzy and raising questions about whether Stephanie White could potentially stand in the way of a future trade. So, what is actually happening behind the scenes? Why has Stephanie White reportedly become part of this controversy? And what could all of this mean for Caitlin Clark's future in Indiana? There are plenty of questions surrounding this developing storyline, so let's break down the situation from the beginning. One particular image has suddenly become the center of attention, and if you focus on the details rather than all the jerseys, arena lights, and background noise, there is a moment that has sparked an entirely different conversation. Caitlin Clark was seen speaking with her agent, Erin Kynan, in the tunnel at Barclays Center, and while a photograph alone cannot prove that a trade demand or behind-the-scenes negotiation was taking place, the timing of that interaction has certainly fueled speculation. This may not simply be another story about a frustrated athlete. It could potentially connect to something much larger involving player power, representation, contract negotiations, and the future of the WNBA's collective bargaining agreement. That is where this story becomes particularly fascinating, because when you connect Clark's recent injury situation, comments from her coaching staff, questions about her role within Indiana's offense, and the ongoing negotiations surrounding the league's next CBA, you begin to see why fans are asking whether something bigger could be developing behind closed doors. Before going any further, it is important to separate confirmed information from speculation, because a photograph of a player speaking with an agent or opposing players does not automatically mean a trade request has been made. Still, the circumstances have created enough discussion to make the situation worth examining. To understand why an agent like Erin Kynan would potentially take such a visible role, you first have to look at what has been happening around Indiana throughout the season. Caitlin Clark has dealt with multiple injuries and missed significant time, and that naturally raises concerns for a player who has built her reputation around toughness, availability, and an enormous offensive workload. But the bigger issue for some fans is not simply the injuries themselves, it is the way those injuries and Clark's recovery have been discussed publicly. Following one of her injury setbacks, Stephanie White described Clark as feeling some discomfort, and Clark's visible frustration on the bench immediately became another talking point. One isolated comment does not establish a disagreement between a coach and player, but when moments like that are combined with larger questions about offensive usage and playing style, they can create the perception of a disconnect. And that is where the story moves from the medical side into the basketball side, because Clark herself has previously emphasized the importance of getting the ball in transition and allowing her to operate with the ball in situations where she can use her creativity most effectively. She has explained that there needs to be a balance between putting the ball in her hands and using her off the ball, while also pointing out that transition opportunities can bring out some of the best parts of her game. That is not necessarily a demand from a superstar expecting everything to revolve around her. It can also be viewed as a player communicating clearly about the situations in which she believes she can be most effective. At the same time, Stephanie White has explained her preference for having multiple ball handlers on the floor and has expressed concern about asking Clark to bring the ball up against pressure for the entire game. From a coaching perspective, that approach makes sense because managing a primary creator's workload can help preserve energy and reduce the amount of physical pressure she absorbs over the course of a game. But from Clark's perspective, the question becomes whether the offensive system is maximizing her biggest strengths. That creates an interesting tactical debate because a franchise player who generates enormous attention and has elite passing and shooting ability naturally becomes most dangerous when she has opportunities to create in space. If the coaching staff believes she needs more off-ball movement and another primary ball handler, while Clark believes she is most effective when she controls the offense in transition, then there is clearly a philosophical difference worth watching. But again, A tactical disagreement does not automatically equal a trade request or a broken relationship. That distinction matters, especially when social media begins turning every interaction into evidence of a larger conspiracy. The tunnel photo involving Clark, her agent, and members of the New York Liberty quickly became one of those moments. Clark was seen interacting with Liberty players, including Sabrina Ionescu and Breanna Stewart, and naturally fans began asking whether it was simply a friendly post-game conversation or something more significant. The reality is that players from different teams often maintain friendships and professional relationships, so an interaction by itself cannot prove that a move is being discussed. However, because Clark is one of the most valuable and heavily discussed players in women's basketball, even an ordinary conversation can become a major online storyline. Once an agent becomes part of the visual, speculation increases even further because fans immediately begin wondering whether there was a strategic purpose behind the interaction. Could it have been nothing more than a normal meeting? Absolutely. Could it eventually become part of a larger story about Clark's future? That remains unknown. The more interesting part of the discussion, however, is the collective bargaining agreement. The CBA essentially serves as the framework governing many aspects of the relationship between players and the league, including contracts, compensation, free agency, player movement, benefits, and other important working conditions. With the WNBA entering a new phase of negotiations, the league's biggest stars naturally have greater leverage than ordinary players because their popularity can influence media attention, revenue, ticket sales, sponsorships, and overall public interest. That does not mean Clark personally controls the negotiations or that her situation is being used as a secret bargaining weapon, but it does explain why her circumstances could become part of broader conversations about player mobility and contractual power. Clark remains under the structure of her rookie contract, which limits the immediate options available to her, and that is precisely why some fans believe the larger CBA negotiations may ultimately matter more than any short-term trade rumor. If future rules provide players with greater mobility, more flexibility, or different restrictions around free agency and player movement, those changes could affect Clark and many other stars across the league. In other words, an agent does not necessarily have to focus exclusively on the next contract. A powerful agent can also think about how the rules governing every future contract might be changed. That is where the speculation becomes much more interesting, because if the players and league are negotiating a new agreement, questions about restricted free agency, trade rights, contract length, player choice, and the balance of power between franchises and athletes naturally become part of the conversation. Imagine a scenario in which the league's biggest star is publicly dealing with questions about her role, injuries, team direction, and future. Even without making a formal trade demand, that situation could create pressure for the league and the players' union to examine whether existing rules provide enough flexibility for elite players. But this is still speculation, and there is no confirmed evidence in the material provided that Clark or her representatives are using the Indiana situation as an official bargaining strategy. What we can say is that the timing makes the discussion intriguing. The WNBA is entering a critical period in its business development. Player salaries are expected to become an increasingly important topic, and the league's growing popularity means players have more leverage than ever before. That brings us to another major factor, the possibility of significant player movement across the league. With the WNBA continuing to expand and its competitive landscape changing, roster construction could become dramatically different over the next several seasons. Expansion teams, new contracts, changing salary structures, and evolving free agency rules could all create opportunities for players to reconsider where they want to play. For a player of Clark's profile, that possibility naturally attracts enormous attention. But fans should be careful about treating rumors as confirmed news. A conversation with an agent, a meeting with opposing players, frustration during a game, or disagreements over offensive strategy can all become pieces of a viral narrative without necessarily adding up to an actual trade request. The most important question is what happens next. Does Indiana adjust its offensive approach to maximize Clark's strengths? Does Clark return healthy and continue building her relationship with the coaching staff? Does the team publicly address the speculation? Or do the rumors simply disappear once the next game begins? Those developments will tell us much more than a single photograph ever could. What makes this story so compelling is that Clark's future is connected to much more than one franchise. She has become one of the central figures in the growth. The possibility of a massive wave of unrestricted free agency could completely reshape the WNBA, with many prominent players potentially gaining the freedom to choose their next destination without their current teams having matching rights. If that situation develops as many analysts expect, the league could experience an extraordinary period of player movement, with rosters changing rapidly, new super teams forming almost overnight, and established competitive structures being disrupted in ways that would have been difficult to imagine only a few years ago. The timing makes the situation surrounding Caitlin Clark even more intriguing because any major changes to player mobility and free agency rules could have implications far beyond one individual player. Clark and her representation would not necessarily have to wait for the market to change before thinking about how the rules themselves could evolve. If the next collective bargaining agreement gives players greater control over their careers, those changes could eventually benefit dozens of other stars as well. That is why Clark's situation, even if it never results in a trade, could become part of a much larger discussion about superstar empowerment in the WNBA. At the same time, it is important to be extremely careful about turning speculation into fact. There is no confirmed evidence that Caitlin Clark has demanded a trade to the New York Liberty, and there is no verified indication that her agent is secretly negotiating a specific move on her behalf. The idea that the tunnel interaction, the questions surrounding her role in Indiana, and the CBA negotiations are all directly connected remains a theory based on timing, circumstances, and the enormous attention surrounding Clark. That distinction matters because a photograph of Clark speaking with Liberty players or her agent being present does not automatically prove that a trade discussion occurred. It could have been an ordinary post-game interaction between people who know each other, or it could eventually become one small piece of a much larger story. Right now, we simply do not know. And that uncertainty is exactly what makes the situation so interesting. Why was Clark's agent present during the interaction? Was it completely routine? Was the conversation simply friendly? Or could it eventually become relevant to a larger discussion about Clark's future? Those questions remain unanswered, and the facts will ultimately matter more than any viral theory circulating online. What is undeniable is that Caitlin Clark has become one of the most influential figures in the WNBA, and wherever her career goes next, an enormous audience will be watching. If the new CBA changes the rules surrounding contracts, free agency, player movement, or negotiations, those changes could affect Clark and countless other players for years. That is the much bigger story. This is not simply about Indiana, New York, or one superstar potentially changing teams. It is about how much control professional athletes should have over their careers, how franchises build around their most valuable players, and how a rapidly expanding league adapts when its biggest stars have more leverage than ever before. If the upcoming free agency environment becomes as dramatic as many observers anticipate, the WNBA could look significantly different in the next few seasons. Teams could make aggressive moves, stars could explore new opportunities, front offices could completely rethink roster construction, and players could gain greater influence over where and how they want to build their careers. That is why the conversation surrounding Clark is so important even if nothing happens immediately. She could remain with Indiana, the Liberty connection could turn out to be nothing more than a friendly interaction, and no trade could ever materialize. Yet the fact that millions of fans are discussing these possibilities tells us something about how much the landscape has changed. Fans are watching more closely, media organizations are paying attention, and front offices understand that every major decision involving Clark will receive extraordinary scrutiny. The next chapter will depend on what actually happens rather than what social media predicts. Does Clark remain focused on getting healthy and continuing her career with the Indiana Fever? Does Indiana make adjustments to better fit her strengths? Does the coaching relationship evolve? Does the new CBA provide players with substantially more control over their futures? Or does the entire trade discussion eventually disappear? Those are the questions worth following. And if an official trade request ever occurs, if the Fever make a major roster decision, if the Liberty becomes directly involved, or if Clark herself addresses the speculation, the entire conversation would immediately change. Until then, the smartest approach is to separate confirmed information from analysis and avoid presenting theories as established facts. Because in a league moving this quickly, today's rumor can become tomorrow's headline, but only reliable information can tell us what the story actually is. The larger picture is much more fascinating than one viral photograph. Caitlin Clark's injuries, the questions surrounding her offensive role, the attention surrounding her relationship with Indiana, her interactions with players around the league, her representation, and the ongoing